Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am not going to presume to introduce Dr. Tellis to an audience such as this. He's a well-known personality and a familiar face in Delhi, except to say that he was the special assistant to Ambassador Robert Blackwell from 2001 to 2003. He was a prominent participant, interlocutor, facilitator during the Indo-US nuclear negotiations that went on for quite some time. And of course, he's a very astute observer, commentator, and analyst of everything that happens in Indo-US relations. And no sooner does a leaf fall that Ashley produces a monograph, which is a delight to read, and it's so comprehensive and so meticulously done that it leaves you quite aghast. So I'm not going to spend too much time on introducing him, but I will take 2 minutes to the story up to the point that he's going to take off from. I'll just give you a little bit of background. Now, the Indian Navy started planning for itself soon after independence. In fact, the British officers who were on deputation to us did our planning, and that plan envisaged some aircraft carriers and air power out at sea right from 1948. And in fact, it was 3 aircraft carriers and a couple of hundred aircraft, so that India would have a navy which would be sort of a surrogate for the British Commonwealth, mainly to deter any signs of Soviet incursions seeking a warm water port here. So as a part of that, the grandiose plan didn't take off, but we did get an aircraft carrier in 1961 with some modestly capable aircraft, and that soldiered on for about 40 years. In the mid-80s, we acquired another second-hand aircraft carrier from the Royal Navy. Both of them were equipped with a Sea Harrier, and they were both equipped with a device called a ski jump, which is nothing but a ramp in the front end of the ship. It facilitates the operations of only the Sea Harrier, an aircraft like the Sea Harrier, which is a V-stall aircraft. So a ski jump is used in the West only by the Sea Harrier, and no other aircraft can use it. Now, this was the time that our warship design capabilities, we built some warships, so we got ambitious and we said, why don't we build an aircraft carrier for ourselves? But therein lay a dilemma. Which aircraft do we operate from this aircraft carrier, and hence what design philosophy do we follow? So the point I'm actually making to you is that an aircraft carrier design is predicated by the kind of aircraft that will operate from it. And to put it in a nutshell, if you equip your aircraft carrier with a ski jump, then it can only operate the Sea Harrier. But if you put a catapult, which is a device which launches an aircraft with brute power, then you have a wide range of choices. American, French, and so on aircraft are available. Now, up to that point, due to geopolitical reasons, we were quite sure that, hello Indrani, that a catapult which is manufactured only in the United States of America, no other country makes it, we were quite sure that a catapult would not be available to us. Hence, when we were planning our aircraft carrier, we said we'll put a ski jump. And at that point of time, providentially, the Russians did something quite revolutionary. They took some land-based aircraft and made them capable of taking off from a ski jump. So again, one of it kind of happening. And so we decided to equip our aircraft carrier with a ski jump, and that put us on the other side of the line. We could only operate Russian aircraft. So the crux of the matter is that till now, or till quite recently, we had no hope of getting an American catapult, therefore no hope of operating a Western type aircraft from our ships. But suddenly, this window of opportunity has opened, not suddenly, but 4 or 5 years ago, relationships have developed. Now it appears that the Americans will not only offer us a catapult, we may have an opportunity to get some aircraft from them. And therefore, now that our first indigenous aircraft is in the water, it is in the final stages of getting ready. It is equipped with a ski jump. It will only operate a Russian MiG-29 and an Indian-designed Tejas. But we are now on the threshold of designing a second indigenous aircraft carrier. And from here onwards, Ashley will take on the tail and tell you how the story goes.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Arun. That was, I really appreciate you taking the time to come here this afternoon and actually chair this meeting. If there's anyone who merits the old phrase, an officer and a gentleman, it's Admiral Arun Prakash, both for his service to the Navy and after retirement, his continued service to the country, both through the National Security Advisory Board and all that he did actually to help India's struggle for jointness, not to mention actually the contributions he also made to the naval nuclear deterrent, which one day I hope he will write a book about when he gets to that point. So I want to thank you very much for sharing this and for also saving me from much embarrassment when I was writing the piece. Arun actually is very kind to read it and to make a slew of very, very helpful suggestions. Of course, a very special set of thanks to Tarun and Kiran and the Ananta Aspen Center for hosting this afternoon. As Arun mentioned, in the last few years, there has been a tremendous transformation in US-India relations, which has opened a door to possibilities that obviously did not exist decades ago, and represents an opportunity to do things that are really interesting and substantial from the viewpoint of advancing common security interests. Just a few months ago, the relationship took another forward turn when President Obama and Prime Minister Modi agreed that one additional project under the rubric of the Defense Trade and Technology Initiative, which was initiated by now Deputy Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, would include the development of an aircraft carrier. And when that happened, I thought this represented, of course, a remarkable opportunity of some magnitude that is very significant. And I thought I should insert myself in the process and offer my unsolicited thoughts to both governments on how they ought to exploit this opportunity. The reason for doing that, in my view, is threefold. The US has a strategic interest in ensuring that the Indian Navy's combat power in the Indian Ocean remains second to none. And this interest is not driven by any sense of altruism, but clear self-interests. The world is getting more complicated. US resources are not infinite. And we have to look for creative ways in which we can leverage the strength and capabilities of our friends and allies. And as we look to the international environment in the decades to come, I think there is a very clear conviction shared in the United States across the political spectrum that India will become a critical partner in that effort. And when Secretary of Defense Panetta came to Delhi, he, in fact, very boldly declared that India would be the linchpin of the US pivot to Asia. Now, you might dismiss that as hyperbole, and there was probably an element of hyperbole to that. But the nugget of truth in that proposition, I think, is inescapable. India's location, the commonality that we share with India, and the fact that we have common adversaries in the region puts us in a position where we can actually help each other. And so the first objective of this exercise should be to aid India to build up its naval capabilities in ways that will achieve certain common interests. The second objective, from my point of view, is that the aircraft carrier project, among others, provides the United States another opportunity to show that we can increase India's strategic capabilities in ways that only Russia and Israel have done thus far. It is a common complaint, especially among my friends in the armed forces, that the talk in the United States has quite outpaced the walk where it comes to US-India relations. That the Americans are quite happy to go in boldly and make brave statements about the character of the cooperation that is envisaged. But when it comes to actually delivering on the substance, we fall short. And I think, there comes a point where we ought to take these complaints seriously. And so when one looks at the future of US-India defense cooperation, I don't think the United States, if it is wise, should cede the field to the Russians and the Israelis or others. And so from my vantage point, the aircraft carrier provides a fantastic opportunity for the US to correct the deficit with respect to issues of delivery where the partnership is concerned. The third reason for doing this, in my judgment, is to exploit the demonstration effects that come from partnering in a very high visibility program that has potentially great impact. The great thing about aircraft carriers is that they are seen. I mean, they are huge ships. They make a manifest statement by their very presence. And the fact that we could potentially cooperate in aircraft carrier development takes cooperation into an entirely different level from, say, cooperating in a system that has a lower profile or cooperating in some subsystems area which are not visible to the general publics. So there is an opportunity here to derive the benefits of demonstration effects to the wider region. The United States would make a huge statement if it were to visibly cooperate with India in developing a major capital ship like an aircraft carrier. And I think only advantages would redound to India if such cooperation was brought to completion. Now, the paper that I've written is, from my point of view, an exercise in provocation, because I wanted to make certain that both sides don't aim low and then reach even lower. And so what I decided to do was to kind of apply some thought to try and identify the most expansive vision of cooperation possible. And I did that not because I'm naive, though sometimes I am, but because I think if we don't challenge ourselves to do something really important, then we are guaranteed that what we will end up with is something insignificant. And so I thought it is better to err on the side of being ambitious rather than to be overwhelmed by the complexities of politics, of technology transfers, and simply settle for something that is mediocre. So when I say it's an exercise in provocation, it was done with the purpose of really challenging people to think beyond their comfort zones. And that applies as much in New Delhi as it does in Washington. Let me start by saying I'm going to divide my remarks. I want to keep time for conversation, but I'm going to divide my remarks very briefly in two broad areas, thinking about the context and then thinking about the nature of cooperation itself. Let me say 3 or 4 things about context. To my mind, there are many challenges that India is going to face in the long term with respect to its security. A novel challenge is the challenge that is going to materialize in the Indian Ocean. The challenge is going to take the form, essentially, of a new Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean that will be quite substantial and quite different from the kind of presence that China has maintained in the past. In the past, it had virtually no presence for practical reasons. In recent years, that presence has been extremely modest and driven primarily by China's activities in the anti-piracy patrols in the Gulf of Aden. But it has become very clear, if you look at the pattern of Chinese intelligence ships that have entered the ocean since 2012, at least 2012, it has become very obvious that the Chinese are planning for a long-term presence in the Indian Ocean. From their point of view, driven primarily by a desire to protect their energy traffic, which comes from the Persian Gulf through the Southeast Asian Straits to the Chinese coast. And China has now reached a point where it is unwilling to rely on the United States to, in a sense, provide naval security as a collective good for China. So the Chinese will seek to protect their sea lines of communication, particularly energy traffic, and that will require a presence in the Indian Ocean. That, by necessity, means that India will be faced with a new set of challenges that come from the ocean, of the kind that it has not faced before. And over time, it is possible, in fact likely, that the Chinese naval presence in the Indian Ocean will take the form of aircraft carriers, submarines, and other surface and subsurface strike operations. Now, India's response to this challenge must necessity be a joint response. This is not a challenge that any one fighting service can deal with by itself. So by necessity, it will be a joint response. It will be primarily, of course, Air Force and Navy. But my paper focuses on the naval dimension. One could spend some time talking about what the Air Force contribution could be and so on and so forth. So this is not a paper that is attempting to deal with the totality of how India should respond, but just the naval contribution to that. And in that context, the argument that the paper makes is that India has to think about this challenge primarily through the creation of a balanced fleet. And a balanced fleet would, again, of necessity, involve large deck aircraft carriers, which have catapults on them. So moving away from the current model, which Admiral Prakash very concisely explained, the history thereof, moving away from the current model, which relies essentially on ski ramp carriers, the so-called stow-bar carriers, short takeoff but arrested recovery carriers, to something that in the trade is called a catobar carrier, which is a catapult-assisted takeoff, barrier arrested recovery. There are reasons for building ships like this, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But that's pretty much the context within which the paper sets out to make the argument. So I'm now going to say a few words about the character of the cooperation. It starts off with the premise that India has never built a large deck catobar carrier before. And it is extremely difficult to build a successful large deck catobar carrier on the first try. I mean, I don't think you should fool yourself into believing that just because India has successfully built a stow-bar carrier, that automatically translates into the capacity to build a catobar carrier of 65,000 tons. On the other hand, the United States Navy has been building large deck carriers of this kind for now at least 30 years, if not longer. So there is a natural synergy between India, which has need, and the United States, which has enormous capability. And the point I make is that even though there is a synergy between need and now availability, what would actually help is if the Indian Navy thinks of this beyond simply procurement. So if the Navy thinks about this simply as this is an opportunity to procure certain things, which it can then include or integrate into its ships, it would certainly help build a better vessel, no question. But to my mind, it would be an opportunity lost, because the real opportunity is not simply acquiring discrete pieces of technology, but actually cooperatively working towards building a vessel that is operationally effective. So I make the argument that we need to think ambitiously, and we need to think of this as something more than just a procurement exercise, because the procurement will take place anyway. I mean, the US and India have now had the history of defense procurement for 15 years, and that will continue. But if this is to be worthwhile, advancing those three objectives that I outlined earlier, then it has to be more than just simply procurement. And again, the objective is that the United States and India must partner to build a superior carrier capability relative to whatever China can bring to bear in the Indian Ocean. Now, there are many dimensions to what make superior carrier capabilities, but there are three operational objectives that have to be satisfied. First is you need better scouting relative to what the adversary has. It's an old maxim of naval warfare that you need to be able to see the other guy at longer ranges that he can see you, and you need to see him first before he can see you. Because if you can see him first, then you can bring firepower to bear in taking him down before he even has a chance to repay the compliment. So scouting is absolutely the key. The second is, on the point of view of a carrier, you want to be able to deploy the largest number of advanced combat aircraft capable of carrying the heaviest ordnance loads on a ship. Remember, at the end of the day, the carrier has a small number of aircraft relative to what you can have on a land base. So when the ship goes out to sea, you want to make certain that it's essentially packed with the largest number of aircraft possible. Now, the great thing about naval technology is that the logic of technology actually makes it sensible to build larger carriers rather than smaller carriers. There are strange things called square cube laws and things like that, which actually make this viable. So from my vantage point, India should build the largest possible carrier that it can, because of its ability to then pack the carrier with advanced combat aircraft that are capable of having large amounts of ordnance. And the third characteristic that you need is the carrier must be designed in such a way that it can maximize sortie rates. Remember, the aircraft carrier exists for only one purpose. The one purpose is to launch aircraft. So if you think of it as a competition between two aircraft carriers, and one aircraft carrier can launch the largest number of aircraft faster, recover them faster, send them back into the fight faster, that carrier has an advantage relative to the competition. So carrier warfare is really a struggle between two groups that are distinguished by their scouting capability, the combat capability represented in terms of numbers and types of aircraft, and then finally the ability to actually conduct what they call cyclic operations, which is, get these things off, conduct the mission, come back, recover, rearm, go back into the fight, et cetera, et cetera. Now, to make this thing work, the paper discusses 6 different functions, what in the trade is called float, fight, move, enable, survive, and integrate. My view is that the best advantages the US brings to this is in the fight function. And there are 3 or 4 things that I emphasize. The US and India should work seriously with respect to optimizing flight deck design. This may seem trivial, but the fact of the matter is, depending on how you design the flight deck, it has an enormous consequence with respect to how you do sorties. And we have spent a lot of time thinking about this. In fact, a lot of time went into thinking about how you optimize flight deck design when we designed the new Ford class aircraft carriers. But the same principles are essentially adaptable to any aircraft carrier, no matter what the size. The second is the catapult. And Admiral Prakash indicated that the US is the only country in the world that builds catapults. Now, there are 2 types of catapults. One is a steam catapult, which is what we've essentially had on aircraft carriers for about 50 years. The problem with steam catapults is that they put enormous stresses on the aircraft because you cannot exquisitely tune the catapult to the weight of the aircraft. That's the problem with the steam catapult. So what you do is you essentially overcompensate by throwing maximum thrust because you want to make certain that you can get this airplane off the carrier. Now, when you do that, it shortens the aircraft's life because you have to overcompensate when you have a steam catapult. So the US is now developing a technology called the electromagnetic aircraft launch system, which is essentially an electric catapult. It's enormously expensive, but the great advantage of the so-called EMAL system is that it can be exquisitely tuned to whatever the weight of the aircraft is. So in theory, it can throw everything from a very light, unmanned combat aircraft system all the way to something extraordinarily heavy, like an F-18 or an F-35, and anything in between. So there is enormous variability. And there are other advantages which I talk about in the paper, which you can look at. So I've argued that the US should seriously think about transferring or licensing this technology to India for its new carrier. There's a catch, though, and I'll come to the catch in a second. The third thing I've talked about is the air wing. India has to think of what kind of aircraft, and Admiral Prakash is absolutely right. You need to have your aircraft first in mind before you start thinking about a carrier. And my argument is that given that the Chinese will have late 4th generation aircraft on their aircraft carriers, it is in India's interest to actually have a 5th generation aircraft on board the ship. And the best 5th generation aircraft today at sea is the F-35. It's still quite immature in terms of some technologies, but it has no competitors where 5th generation aircraft are concerned, except for the F-22. And we have made a policy decision that we will not sell F-22s to anyone. But even more important, we do not have a naval version of the F-22. Whereas the F-35 is a navalized aircraft, there's also a marine version, an Air Force version, what have you. So the argument I make is India should look seriously at an F-35 if it wants to think of a 5th generation aircraft for its air wing. Let me say a couple of things about the move function. The big decision India has to make about the ship is propulsion, whether it's going to be conventionally propelled or whether it's going to be nuclear propelled. Obviously, nuclear propulsion is desirable for many reasons, but there are 2 big constraints where nuclear propulsion are concerned. The first is the cost, and 2, the second constraint is that it's very rare for countries to actually collaborate with respect to naval nuclear propulsion. The United States has collaborated only with Great Britain when naval nuclear propulsion is concerned. And India will, if it goes nuclear, will have to think of doing this more or less on its own. But I have argued that the US government should think about reviewing its own policy with respect to cooperation on naval nuclear propulsion, because that opens a door to collaboration of the kind that has not occurred before. Now, the reason for considering nuclear propulsion in the Indian case is actually linked to the EMALS. For all the advantages of the EMALS, which is an enormous amount of electrical power, and if India were to try and integrate the EMALS into a conventionally propelled aircraft carrier, first, it will be very difficult to do. Two, India would end up having to pack the ship with so many generators that it is likely to, the ship's displacement is likely to exceed the 65,000 ton target. And it's not even clear that even if the generators are packed into the ship, that you would get that kind of surplus power to run. So as a practical matter, what I say in the paper is, if you don't have nuclear, you're condemned to a steam catapult with all the consequences thereof. If you want EMALS, you have to seriously think about nuclear propulsion. But then with nuclear propulsion come cost issues, safety issues, and then the whole question of will India be able to design a power plant for a nuclear carrier more or less independently. Finally, of course, there's the whole question of the integration of all the moving parts on an aircraft carrier, and I argue that we should think seriously about cooperation on the integration function, because that's where the high payoff is. Now, actually at Admiral Prakash's reminder, I spent some time looking at issues like shipbuilding and stuff like that, because I think part of what the cooperation must not simply be to build a ship, not simply to build a carrier, but to use that as a leveraging device to aid India in improving its shipbuilding capacity, shore infrastructure, and so on and so forth. Let me end by just making one question. Why are we doing all this? To my mind, the strategic arguments I've already made. But the operational argument for me has to be interoperability. That is, you do this at the end of the day because you hope that India and the United States can actually operate in practical terms towards some certain common purposes. Now, I know interoperability immediately gets people's hackles up here, and the hairs on your back stand up and do funny things, and so on and so forth. But to my mind, interoperability does not commit India to changing what is its independent foreign policy. Interoperability simply means that you're building the capacity to do things together when you choose to do it. And so whether India chooses to do it is a decision that its government has to make as a sovereign government. But if it chooses to do it, it would be nice to have the capacity to do it, which means you have to think ahead of time what pieces have to fall in place in order to make that happen. And so I make the argument that both countries' interests are served by actually thinking seriously about interoperability, even if in practical terms we may end up operating together only rarely, relative to the potential that's out there. So thank you very much and for your attention.
Can we go on to 5:15? Is that all right? Right. Thanks, Ashley. I was delighted that you turned your razor-sharp mind to this particular topic, because it's very dear to one's heart. And ladies and gentlemen, I've spent many years on aircraft carriers, but if and when you do read his paper, you'll realize what the familiarity that he brings to his writing is quite amazing. A sailor probably wouldn't have been able to write a paper such as this. And earlier he'd written a monograph called The Dog Fight, or Dog Fight, in the context of the MMRCA, the Air Force Medium Combat Aircraft Selection. And once again, that paper read like a test pilot's test report. So I asked him, how much flying experience do you have? And he said, all of some 50,000 frequent flyer miles on United Airlines. Okay, actually, having said that, I mean, it's a paper that would gladden the heart of any Indian Navy sailor. Let me start on the geopolitical plane and say that this is eminently desirable. We'd love to do all this. But if and when this happens, it's a multi-pronged kind of handshake. It's military, business, industry, technology. And to those who are observing developments, it will seem like we've jumped into the American bandwagon. China is going to get very upset, and as a reaction, the first thing they do is to arm Pakistan. So that will be one consequence we have to live with. Russia is going to be terribly upset again, because now once we build an American designed and American equipped aircraft carrier, their business is going to go down. So do you think that our political establishment, given their constraints, the toxic political environment in Delhi, do you think that this is feasible prima facie? Once you give me an answer, then we can discuss the other details.
Obviously, these are considerations that any Indian policymaker has to take into account. Are you making things worse at another level if you're doing something at
Because we could make an aircraft carrier which is a replica of the earlier one, and
Right.
things will be quite peaceful.
Right, and obviously this is something that is an option that India has, and it doesn't have to go in the direction that I argue. But what is the downside? The downside is that you deprive yourself of a capability that, in my judgment, India will need, because when you think of what the Chinese will be able to do, partly with Russian help, partly through simply cloning Russian equipment without their permission, they will be able to put to sea a vessel of some significant combat capability. Now, what they lack is the operating experience. That's where the Indian Navy has a terrific advantage, because, as you pointed out, India has run aircraft carriers pretty much since '61 continuously. China is just a newbie in the game. But I always remind people, and I have to do this with my own colleagues in the United States, because you have US Navy admirals who poo-poo the Chinese naval aircraft, the aircraft carrier, and they say, oh, it's great, let the Chinese build aircraft carriers. It's a nice, fat, big target for us to sink. And I say, yeah, that's true, but you would not have said that about Japanese carriers in 1941. Even though, 20 years earlier, the Japanese were also newbies into the game. So the problem is, competence is not any country's monopoly. People acquire competence. And so before you know it, the Chinese will acquire competence in running an aircraft carrier. And by the time the Indian 65,000-ton Catabar carrier comes in, we are talking of something that's a decade away anyway, at the earliest.
But the die would have been cast the day this whole agreement
Correct.
is signed.
Correct. But that is a die that is cast not out of lack of forethought. You cast the die because, in my judgment, that is a smart thing to do. Let me address the two countries that you mentioned, because they're both important. China is not going to change its strategy towards India because India decides it is going to cooperate with the United States in building an aircraft carrier. The Chinese have already made their judgments about what they need to do to balance growing Indian power. And they are going to pursue with that policy, whether that policy involves Pakistan, whether that involves the other smaller states in the region, or whether it involves bilateral interactions with India, irrespective of what India does with the United States. So yes, there will be trade-offs that India has to take into account when it makes these choices. But I think if someone could honestly make the argument that if we don't make this deal with the United States, China's grand strategy vis-a-vis India would be radically different. It would be, far more cooperative. Then I would have to rethink my argument seriously. But I cannot persuade myself that if India does not do this, somehow the Chinese will move in an entirely different direction. So I'm operating on the assumption that Chinese grand strategy transcends India. They have figured out what they want to do vis-a-vis the United States, vis-a-vis others. And so now it's India that has to make a decision as to how it equips itself to deal with that reality. With respect to Russia, I think the challenges are actually far fewer, because the Russians today are not in the carrier business anymore. Every Russian carrier that was built was built.
They want to build our next carrier.
They do.
In Sverdlovsk.
Okay, but they have not built a carrier since they were last built in the days of the Soviets, right? I am not sure that the Russians would lose greatly if India decided to move in the United States. And the reason for doing it actually has nothing to do with Russia. If you looked at Russian carriers, even at their best, compared to their US equivalents, there was no comparison. No. Because the Russians never used carriers in a way that we did. The amazing thing is, if you look at the Indian document, the Indian naval strategy documents that have been put out now in 2 iterations, India's naval strategy and its way of conceiving about naval power is almost analogous to the way the United States thinks about naval power, because it is thinking of naval power as a maritime state does, rather than as a continental state. For the Russians, having an aircraft carrier was simply meant to fortify a barrier defense to attacks on the homeland. For the United States, naval power is about sea control way beyond the continent. The Indian Navy, if you take the documents at face value, is also thinking of sea power in that sense. And so I see this as an opportunity for 2 countries that have parallel sets of interests, that think of naval power in certain ways, and that can build a carrier that is very different from the kind of carriers that the Soviet Union and now the Russians, presumably will build.
So let's take it from here. But then in that case, I think you will have to reconsider your phrase about US actions not being altruistic. They will need to be a little altruistic. They'll need to hold India's hand a little further for geopolitical reasons. Let me come to the nuts and bolts now. So if you think that an EMOL catapult, that's an electromagnetic catapult, which is a great advancement on the existing steam catapult, which is equally good for us as far as we are concerned. So we would like to have an EMOLs, but the electrical power demands of an EMOLs requires an engine which is not available to us, which means that we go for nuclear power. Now we do have a nuclear reactor which we have designed and fitted on our nuclear submarine, but that reactor is too small to power aircraft carrier. Now we could put 6 or 8 of those reactors on a ship and make a complete mess of it, but it's a possibility. But a much neater solution would be that if the USA is going that distance to help us, then give us some advice or help on designing a nuclear reactor which would drive an aircraft carrier. Of course, nuclear reactors have various sinister connotations, but if you look at this, a propulsion, it's like a diesel engine or a gas turbine engine, and it's a nuclear reactor. It can be sealed. It has no, I don't know whether it has any proliferation connotations. So I would say that if you are proposing in the goodness of your heart that we should buy an EMOLs, and USA gives us an EMOLs, then a nuclear reactor or substantive design assistance to design a reactor and put it on a ship is inevitable. Okay, let me give you a subsequent, that if this is not feasible, US Congress, etc., then the best thing for us is to go for a steam catapult, which is something that we hadn't, it was beyond our dreams till 5-6 years. A steam catapult and an F-18 combination, that would be plan B before plan A. So let's have your...
Well, let me start with the nuclear reactor question. I mean, I'm of the view that the US should revisit its policy with respect to naval nuclear propulsion cooperation. But I'll tell you, this is a subject that is extremely touchy, and it will take a lot of hard work.
Can you extract fuel from
No, I mean, you could, in theory. But think about it this way. Take a US aircraft carrier, for example. A Nimitz class carrier usually gets refueled once in its lifetime.
50 years.
And its lifetime is 50 years. So you have one refueling somewhere midway through the life of the carrier. And what is done when you refuel, it's what is called a refueling complex overhaul. The ship has to go into a shipyard. And it's basically out of commission for anywhere between a year to 3 years. Now, that's not entirely because of refueling, because they also update the ship and modernize it and stuff. But when you have to refuel an aircraft carrier, it is it's a very complex operation. So the idea that you can somehow use an aircraft carrier at sea to make nuclear materials for a bomb is simply beyond the range of plausibility. So it's not the proliferation consequences of nuclear cooperation that prevent cooperation with respect to naval nuclear reactors. The problem with naval nuclear reactors is that they have, and this is most visible for submarines, but it's also true for ships to a lesser degree. They are made extremely compact. They are made highly survivable, so that even if there is
action,
even if there's action, it can take that. And to do that, you end up having to engage in highly sensitive proprietary design issues. And the US is very uncomfortable with sharing that with others. So you're really at the acme of nuclear design when you're talking of naval nuclear propulsion.
If you in one of your briefings to the Congress, if you tell them that the Soviets and the Russians entrusted their nuclear reactors to us for 13 years, we've had them, we could have designed, redesigned, copied them. So what does USA bring to the table which which Russia couldn't?
I mean, I'll tell you, if I ever were to make that argument, the Congress would wish me well and tell me to go back to New Delhi and tell India to talk to the Russians again. Because the standard argument there would be, well, the Russians are doing it, we don't like it, but better the Russians do it than us. See, the problem is this. If you think of naval nuclear propulsion as being highly advanced and highly sophisticated technology, then the presumption simply is we don't want to share it with
Icebreakers use
I
nuclear
agree.
reactors.
I agree. So what I argue in the paper is that in purely policy terms, you can make a compelling argument for why the United States should revisit its policy on naval nuclear cooperation. Because in principle, we have done it with one country, Great Britain. Now, of course, Great Britain is our closest ally, and therefore, and there is a long history actually of joint nuclear cooperation going back to the Manhattan Project. So Great Britain and the United States actually cooperated in the production of nuclear weapons in the 1940s. And so there is a history there that makes it palatable to the United States. With India, it becomes a harder sell. Now, the point that I make in the paper is, if this is important enough to India, then it is a conversation that needs to be had between the Indian government and the US government at the highest levels. It really cannot be done by Ashley Tellis going to people and telling them, I have a bright idea for you. Open my, overcoat and show them the picture of a nuclear reactor. It's not going to happen. It's going to happen only because the Prime Minister decides that this is important enough for India's naval modernization, raises it with the President, and believe me, it's not something the President is going to do simply on the basis of a conversation. He will come back, there will be studies done on this subject, people will look at the trade-offs and so on and so forth. But I argue that this is something that ought to be done for exactly the point that you made, that if you don't do this, then the emails technology becomes suspect, which is how do you get a ship that can generate so much electric power to run this? Now let's think of the fallback, right? Let's assume naval nuclear cooperation does not happen because the odds of it happening are high. The odds against it happening are high. So you go back to steam catapults. If you go back to steam catapults, India will certainly be sold a steam catapult. In fact, the US is now going through the process of looking at the licensing with respect to emails. And I think we will find a way to enable the emails to be sold to India. I'm quite confident of that. But if India goes to steam catapults, the strategic question with respect to the airplane still remains. Does India want to buy a fourth generation airplane, which is maybe good enough, or does it want to think of the challenges 25, 30 years out and invest in a fifth generation system? My own view is that, the F-18E, which is a superb airplane, particularly with respect to the avionics, sensors, and weapons, it's quite phenomenal. I mean, it's quite a phenomenal airplane. My own view is that that will serve India well if it were deployed on an Indian aircraft carrier today. But if you were to ask me the question, will it be the best airplane from India 15 years from now or 20 years from now, I would have to pause before I say yes. My own view is that you are moving into an environment where everyone in the region is going to have airborne warning and control systems, which means that fourth generation airplanes are going to be detected way before you can engage them. And so the premium is going to be on stealthy airplanes of some kind. I mean, I don't care whether India buys the F-35 or doesn't buy the F-35. But the bottom line is that when you think in terms of the future operating environment, the operating environment is, the premium is going to be on stealthy airplanes, because you will have to defeat not only passive detection systems, but you will have to defeat active detection systems. And the Chinese will almost certainly have an AVAX-like airplane on their carriers at some point in the next 10 years. They don't have one today, but they have a series of aircraft platforms that they are exploring. And when they get a large deck carrier, it will come with essentially a E2C type airplane on that carrier.
And a catapult.
And a catapult. And a catapult.
But this morning we had a US Navy admiral telling a naval audience that the F-18 will be very much in service by till 2030, if not a few years.
In fact, I think part of the problem is that the F-35, you know, the fear is that the costs of it and the technology issues and stuff are such that the Navy will, in fact, there is an issue now with buying additional F-18s beyond what was, you know, what was anticipated. So it will be in the fleet. And I don't think India should rule out the option of an F-18 type airplane if for whatever reason, as an interim combat aircraft.
Okay, I had a couple of points, but I think it's, in all fairness to our audience here, we should throw the house open. Ladies and gentlemen. Yes, sir. Lalit, you're next. Number 3.
Actually, 2 short questions. One is, the Americans in the Second World War were able to demonstrate the vulnerability of aircraft carriers, particularly large aircraft carriers. In the Battle of Midway, the Soryu, the Hiryu, the Agaki were sunk by American aircraft, the South China Seas. And then, of course, the largest Japanese ship, Yamato, was also sunk by thunderbolts, you see. That's one aspect. How do you insulate the aircraft carrier of your vision from such air attack? Because one aircraft can actually destroy a large aircraft carrier. So the fencing part of it. And the second question is, from a lawyer's perspective, since I happen to be a limb of the law, the contractual. We have suffered with the Russians. Say in Gorshkov, every day the conditions were being changed, the prices were being raised. What would be the level of contractual trust? You see, that's very important. Because as a lawyer, I believe in every game, the rules are made before the game is played, and the rules can't be changed while the game is being played. So I think both have same kind of lawyers. That would be an important part. What would be the contractual guarantee given to India once India goes in for an American aircraft carrier? Thank you.
Well, let me answer the second question first. I think my understanding of the Indian experience with doing business with American vendors, particularly where airplanes are concerned, has been generally very positive. That the only case where I believe India has had complaints has been actually the first defense sale that we consummated, which was the TP-43, I think it was the motor locating radar.
Electronic.
Yes, where there were endless problems with respect to, you know, sales and servicing and all kinds of stuff. But after that, if you look at the C-17 sales, the C-130 sales, the general experience has been that, other things being equal, India would prefer to do business with American companies, which first are not corrupt, because, you know, we do have a very rigorous Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which has acted as a deterrent to any kind of hanky-panky for the last 30 odd years. And it's a very straight transaction. So once there is a price negotiation and a price is agreed, you know, it has, you know, deliveries, prices, et cetera, have been maintained. So my understanding is that the record of doing business with American companies has been very good. And I don't think that is going to change. It will only get even better over time. On the first question of vulnerability, I think this is a very misunderstood issue. Remember, anything that goes to sea is vulnerable. For that matter, anything that is on land is vulnerable. I mean, people keep telling me, you know, aircraft carrier, you can sing it. I say, yeah, sure you can. But an airbase, can you guarantee that an airbase will not be targeted by things that can, you know, so every system is vulnerable, right? So the key is, how do you mitigate the sources of vulnerability? And for an aircraft carrier, the challenge is to mitigate those sources in 3 dimensions: in the air, on the surface, and under the surface. And this is true, though, for every weapon system that you employ in the armory. So, for example, when you think of air bases over time, air bases are going to be just as vulnerable. as aircraft carriers are. Now, this is an ongoing fight. The struggle between offense and defense never ends. So the only thing I can say to this is, look, you make certain that you buy the best systems money can buy to mitigate vulnerability. Two, you invest in sufficient, what I can crudely call capabilities for situational awareness, so you know where the adversary is, and you develop an operating regime that allows you to target the adversary before the adversary targets you. I mean, that's the best sort of answer that I can give you.
No, tactical acumen while deploying your...
Yes.
Lalit?
I'm Commodore Lalit Kapoor. There's been a lot of talk also about the future of big aircraft carriers. In fact, it's linked to the question that just came up, especially with UAV technology coming in a big way. That's going to take, at least even now, it can take some of the missions away from the aircraft, the number of aircraft that are required to be carried. So once again, we come back. I mean, do we really need something that big to go in, which is going to be coming into service, I'd say about 15 to 20 years from now?
I mean, this is a very good question, and it's one that I can't answer. I mean, the government of India and the Indian Navy has to make the judgment about what is appropriate to its own force structure, right? But the broad point I would make is this, that an aircraft carrier is a floating platform that in principle allows you to deploy any number of things. So there is nothing that prevents you from deploying a combat-capable unmanned system on an aircraft carrier. The advantage of an aircraft carrier is that it moves, so it becomes harder to sort of find. It gives you a certain flexibility because you can operate at great distances from land, and you can do so with actually a rapidity of response that land-based systems cannot. I mean, there's no doubt that if, for example, India went and built a B-52-like aircraft, it would have tremendous global reach, right? I mean, this is a system that has 8,000, that can fly 8,000 miles, or whatever the range is. So you can build systems of enormous capability. The question that India has to ask is, given the water spaces of interest to India, does an aircraft carrier serve its strategic interests? Now, the Navy has made the judgment, and I actually agree with the Navy, is that the aircraft carrier has a role in the context of building a balanced fleet. So you can't say, I'm building only the aircraft carrier. You have to build complementary capabilities to make it effective, and so on and so forth. But my broad argument would be, the carrier is amazingly flexible. Its mobility in many ways is its best defense, because it is actually, people don't realize this, but the oceans are really big, and carriers actually move pretty fast, and it is actually hard to find these things. I mean, the Chinese think that just because you have a DF-21D, suddenly the US Navy's aircraft carriers have become obsolete. I mean, that's a load of bull. I mean, finding the carrier, being able to target it, and so on and so
Anti-ballistic
forth, makes it, it makes it a very difficult
But
task.
Lalit, that's a question you should have addressed Naval Headquarters, not actually tell us. Sir, before you, Mr. Karnad, and then...
Ashley, and I think it's also for Arun. There's a cost trade-off. Main thing is the cost now, because we are really laboring under such austerity measures. To just put the cost idea, you have CVN. Just the construction would cost you about $5 to $6 billion minimum, without any aircraft, without any of the bells and whistles that you put on it.
Yeah.
So just a platform, $5 to $6 billion. Now, that's where I think the arithmetic becomes a bit, shall we say, convoluted. Because you're talking about complementary capabilities. You may get into a situation where the optimum complementary capabilities will not be available, even as you have a platform, which then makes it more vulnerable. The second thing I think is maritime density. Would any naval person, Arun, this is for you to answer, and of course, from a theoretical perspective, Ashley, maritime density matters. how many boats are out there in the sea matters. Would you rather have X+3 light carriers than one CVN? The point then is, your presence then is spread out, because that's what you're worried about. You have optimal presence without all the other problems that accompany a CVN, as I've just told you, in terms of complementary capabilities.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, again, the issue of cost is not, let me go back to the first principles that motivated me to write the paper. I did not set out to make the case for India's aircraft carriers. Okay, so I'm not here to tell India that it should be building large deck carriers that cost anywhere from $3 billion to 12. These are decisions that the government of India has to make. The Indian Navy has to make these decisions. My starting point in the paper is very simple. India has made the decision to build carriers. It wants to cooperate with the United States. My job in the paper is simply to say, what areas should that cooperation take? Why that cooperation should take place, and what is the end result in terms of capability accretion from an Indian point of view. I am perfectly comfortable if someone can come to me and say, that's a great idea, Mr. Tellis, but we think the idea of India spending anywhere between $3 to $12 billion in a single ship is completely cuckoo and we shouldn't do it. That's fine by me. I'll go out and write a different paper on a different subject, right? That's the great advantage of being in the business that you and I are. We are never starved for subjects on which to write papers. But if I start out with the assumption that India has made this choice, then my limited objective is to say, how can I help India make the best vessel possible? And that's really what drives me into this game. Now, on the density question, which I actually have an opinion on, for me, the issue is, you cannot answer that question short of understanding what the threat environment is. Because there may be some threat environments in which having 3 light carriers buys you adequate combat capability. There may be other threat environments where one large, big 70, 60 aircraft carrying carrier actually buys you a lot more. Well, a simple example. How many, the question that I would ask is, how many aircraft would the light carrier carry? Because India has had light carriers in the past. But a light carrier that carries 10 aircraft, 10 fixed-wing aircraft and 5 helicopters is not worth any combat capability worth the name. Then you're much better off going to a surface strike capability as the Soviets did, which large numbers of missiles proliferated over large numbers of platforms. It takes a lot more resources to maintain a small carrier with such small air wings. In contrast, if you think of 3 such carriers, 30 fixed-wing aircraft now with 15 helicopters, right, across 3 carriers, compared to one large deck carrier with, say, 50 aircraft plus. The 50 aircraft plus carrier gives you a lot more in terms of combat power. So again, one needs to run the scenario, game it out, and see, where one comes out ahead.
I agree with Ashley. Firstly, the cost. Gorshkov cost us $3 billion. Vikrant is going to cost us $2.5 to $3 billion. So what is expensive? A nuclear carrier may cost 5, 6, 7 billion, whatever. So, and we didn't bat an eyelid when we spent $3 billion on Gorshkov. Secondly, this exercise of density has been done many times by the US Navy. Elmo Zumwalt wanted a whole series of Harrier carriers. We've done it. No, we've done it. We've driven 18,000 ton carrier, which carried 6, 7, 8 aircraft. We've driven a 30,000 ton carrier. The expense, the more carriers you have, the more expensive it gets. And there is an optimum size which can operate a certain capable air. Vikrant could operate Seahawks or Sea Harriers, and we had to think 10 times before we went into Mirage 3 range of Pakistan Air Force. But if you have a carrier which can operate a MiG-29, and that will be nothing less than 40,000 tons, you can go with your chest out to any waters. So there is an optimal size. Having a carrier as a token is one thing which we've done for 50 years. But having a carrier which can make a difference to the balance of power at sea is something else. And for that, there is an optimal size below which it is not cost effective. Sir, Gyanu, you're after.
Thank you very much.
No, my question would be to Ashley. From what you mentioned in your remarks, perhaps the email system, as you said, is highly energy intensive, which would, I suppose, in turn restrict the area of operation of any carrier, even from an Indian port. Now, that again depends on what we regard as a desirable range, area-wise, of the Indian Ocean, which we'd like to operate, which again, I think in turn depends on how much the Chinese can operate. So all these points are something which I don't think any government has given a serious thought to, but maybe Arun Prakash can tell us more about it. The other point I wanted to mention was that, as both of you, as the Admiral mentioned in his initial remarks, we've heard of this 3 aircraft carrier concept for the Indian Navy, which is really, in my opinion, a defensive concept, because one will be in repair, under repair. If one is far out in the sea, then you have really only one left at headquarters. So it's all right for the Americans with any number of about 20 or 30 or 40 aircraft carriers.
I wish.
10, sorry.
Well, we are struggling to
easier
keep
to
10.
control the entire Pacific, move around the entire Indian Ocean, but with 3 aircraft carrier, as of now at least, it seems to me it's a highly defensive concept only. Thank you very much.
Jan.
Yeah, we are discussing about the next generation aircraft carrier. We have gone through the geopolitical situation, we have spoken, and obviously we cannot disregard the cost factor because that is very much a very relevant thing. But what we need to take into account is a wish list that has been drawn out, and rightfully so, is the near term. Perhaps if we are looking for something, to have a propulsion, nuclear power propulsion, have EMALs, definitely, by all means. And as also brought out, 3 aircraft or 4 aircraft, perhaps as cost permitting, why not 9, 10 aircraft? And therefore, perhaps the propulsion, the kind of catapult that you want to have, could be a consideration for the 3rd or the 4th carrier. And to my mind, if one has to look and address the near-term requirement, steam catapult and regular conventional propulsion. Your comments on that?
Well, I mean, it all depends on when you think this carrier is going to actually, also of cost. If you look, for example, at the cost of an F-35 today, now the F-18 is a special case. An F-18, the US Navy today buys F-18s for $65 million a piece and $80 million with support thrown in. That's the price of an F-18 in the most recent buy, okay? An F-35 today in the most recent buy, Lot 8, is $117 million. So you're talking of enormous expansion of combat capability for actually quite modest differences in cost. If you think of a Rafale today costs about $120 million a piece on sale when you have the sale sticker. If you're talking of a non-sale sticker, you're talking of something that's way above 120 million. So, this is not small change. And so there are complex calculations that you have to make in terms of cost effectiveness. If I spend a marginal increment more, 10% more, 20% more, am I getting greater than proportionate increases in combat capability or not? I mean, all these decisions ultimately hinge on the marginal question, right? I'm going to buy an airplane, whatever the airplane is. As I said, the cheapest is an $80 million airplane. The next cheapest, will be a $120 million airplane. And then you have the Rafale, whose price depends on the day of the week in which you talk to Dassault, right? So the question then becomes, how do you judge, your metric for purchasing this? I have no problems if India says, buy catapults, steam catapults today and 4th generation aircraft. But when you think in terms of a longer term time frame, and I'm thinking in terms of, you got to deal with the Chinese down the line in the Indian Ocean, I want a better ship and a better aircraft than they will bring on board. And for the moment, I think the F-18 will be adequate to the threat, but over the longer term, I would question that.
But Ashley, let me just add that this is a very real life problem, because in naval headquarters, they're actually designing this aircraft carrier today. They want answers. The designers are screaming for answers. Which aircraft, what propulsion? How do we design? So they will be addressed whether we like it or not.
Correct.
What answers are thrown up, one doesn't know.
Correct.
One, two, I don't think we've got time for all these, but one, and you're next, and then if there's time.
Moving away from just the question of, the aircraft carrier and what it's going to look like and interoperability, the trust deficit in itself, we are, I think jumping ahead. Do you think there is still a trust deficit between India and the United States as they go forward?
Well, the unfortunate but true answer is yes. There is a trust deficit. And it's not a trust deficit that will disappear overnight. It's a work in progress. For the United States, the big challenge has been that we have never dealt with India in any meaningful way since the early 2000s. So this is all new for the United States. The last time we had a close military cooperation was 1962. And there it was the US coming to the help of India. So it was a one-way sort of conversation. Post 2001, we are looking at moving towards a genuine partnership. And there are reservations. I mean, I'll tell you what the reservations are at our end. At our end, we have a very cumbersome system, which is very legalistic, and which has all sorts of requirements. So for example, if the United States sells India a widget, there are requirements to make sure that the widget is not misused, is not diverted to other things, and so on and so forth. And India has in the past pushed back at this kind of a system. Now, fortunately, unfortunately for India, this is a system that applies to everyone else in the world. So our allies scream just as vigorously about these requirements as India does. The second issue is for India, India is not part of the US alliance network. So the United States policymakers have to take a leap of faith and say that even though India is going to persist in an independent foreign policy, sometimes opposing US interests on specific issues, it is still worth the bet in terms of helping India become more capable and more powerful. Now, I'll be very honest with you. Not everyone in the United States is persuaded of the necessity of that. There has been a great movement towards recognizing the logic of strengthening India. But it's not one of those issues where there is universal consent. There are powerful, constituencies that are skeptical that this is in our long-term interest. So, there are clearly, we have some ways to go before we close the gap. But to my mind, you don't close the gap in the abstract. You don't sit down and say there's a gap, let's think of smart ways to close the gap. You close the gap only in the concrete. And the more you can do innovative things, and the carrier is one example of an innovation. What we are doing through the DTTI, the Defense Technology Initiative, is another way in which that's how you build the trust. And if these projects take off, then people begin to say, okay, we can actually do business with the Indians. They don't always have horns.
I'm sorry.
It's a way in which we can do business.
Only 3 more questions, Mishra, Rajiv, and.
So I don't have a comment to make. I don't have a question, but a comment to make.
Please make it short.
Yes. We have talked about carriers, but there's a Navy which has a carrier and a Navy which doesn't have a carrier. Just 2 statistics. United States lost only 3 ships after Midway, which operated with the carriers. The ships which were around the carriers. The only time we have lost after that ships in company of carriers is when they were with light carriers. That was in Falklands. So we need to look at it just not from a carrier debate, but from a Navy debate as to whether we want a carrier and what kind of a carrier for the Navy that we want. That's the question.
Point well taken.
But post-World War, the carriers have operated in a relatively benign environment.
Thank you, sir. Commodore Rajiv Sawhney. Just wanted to compliment you, Ashley. As Admiral said, the way you've explained and answered some of the questions better than a lot of us who spend our lifetimes in the Navy could have ever hoped to have done. But my question is basically on your paper, And with the DTTI coming into major prominence, with the Mr. Carter coming in next month, I'm sure your paper has been already read and looked at in the US. What has been the response in the US to your paper?
Tell us.
Has there been positive responses? You said that. I know you covered broadly, but specifically with regard to your paper, has the response been positive at all? Because there are lots of major issues. You said yourself it's very, very ambitious, and I agree with that. Some of the issues have been discussed. And the second connected question is, how do you see this happening with the current standoff as far as the foundational agreements are concerned?
So, two very good questions. I have a very practical answer to the first. The paper was released the day I actually left the United States for travel. So I have absolutely no idea what anyone thinks about it. My suspicion is that it will be seen as a sort of interesting effort at pushing the envelope. My hope is...
John McCain would be pleased?
John McCain will be very pleased. In fact, we had long conversations many years ago on the need to move in this direction, and he's been a great champion of it. And in fairness, even the administration, which I would not have imagined when it came into office, would have been so forward-leaning on India, has been very forward-leaning on India. And I have never seen reservations on the part of senior leaders when you go to them and push them about doing things on India. I mean, if anything, the appetite is to do bigger and bolder things rather than smaller things. So I'm hopeful that even if we don't do the entire menu of things that are in the paper, even moving the conversation towards some of the issues, I think would be a big step forward. My own philosophy on this, having served in India 15 years ago, is that, look, if you don't take risks, you always lose. I mean, we would never have had the 2005 civil nuclear deal if, in October of 2001, we did not start the campaign from the embassy here for that agreement. And when I left the Bush administration, when I left the White House in 2003, basically it felt at that point like, oh, we had fired a shot in the wind. Nobody thought that this thing would actually take off. But it actually did, unbeknownst to me at that point in time. So you never know the remote consequences of your actions, right? So my view is you go out there, you fire on all cylinders, and hopefully something sticks. Someone sees something of value, and you take it from there. But to me, the key is going to be not in the US, the key is going to be here. Because the point that you made, sir, is really the fundamental one. I mean, people have to feel comfortable that going in the direction that I propose with the United States is in India's national interest. If India feels comfortable enough to move in that direction, I have great faith that the US will find a way to respond. My biggest fear is that the Navy and the government more precisely will be so scared of its own shadow that we will not even take the risk of going in that direction. And I'll tell you, that after the paper was written, there were many people who sent me emails, congratulating me and all that stuff, and that's wonderful. But there was a segment of people who wrote to me and said, oh, this is completely crazy. We cannot trust the United States. It is far better for us to go our own way. Even if it takes 30 years for us to build this carrier, we should go out and do it on our own. And we shouldn't have anything to do with the US with respect to even a little widget on the ship. Now, this is not an unrepresentative point of view. There are many in government who feel this way. And if that attitude sort of persists, then obviously we're not going to go very far. So I'm hopeful that as time goes by and attitudes change, we have some,
Vishal, last short question, please.
The type of, Dr. Tellers, the type of super carrier which you are suggesting, it is meant for expeditionary warfare. Now, India has no such requirement at the moment. Its area of interest is Hormuz to Malacca, and perhaps the interests are served by smaller carriers. Now, if the US wanted to make a transformational gesture, wouldn't India's interest be better served? And I'd like to put this question to both. If they were to offer help in building nuclear-powered submarines, SSNs, And even when you're talking about the Chinese challenge in the Indian Ocean, their challenge is also predicated on SSNs. And you yourself observed when you were talking earlier that Russia successfully deterred, the Soviet Union successfully deterred the US in the Cold War despite not being a carrier operator.
Well, there are several parts to that. And if you assume that India's area of interest is broadly the entire northern Indian Ocean, then my view is that a light carrier force actually does not serve its interests as effectively as a large carrier force, for all the reasons that Admiral Prakash mentioned. I mean, a very simple fact. It takes you roughly or comparably the same number of people to run smaller carriers compared to the increases in combat capability when you get from larger carriers. It's not like, a large carrier has 3,000 people, a small carrier has 1,000 people. You come closer to the strength of a large carrier without its combat capability. So what are you actually doing when you go for light carriers? What you're doing is you're expending close to 2/3 the cost of a large carrier with 1/3 the combat capability. That's the equation you want to think about. So it's not that, oh, I have a small carrier force so I can have large numbers of them. That's not true. The cost, it's not a straight line cost curve where, a large carrier which has 1/3 the combat capability is also 1/3 the cost. A small carrier has 2/3 the cost of a large carrier with 1/3 the combat capability. So that's the first point to keep in mind. Two, it is very easy to oversell what land-based combat aviation can do when you are thinking of it in a non-combat environment. So if you say, draw me the range circles of a land-based aircraft, you can draw some fantastic range circles if it's not a combat environment where, you don't have to worry about dog legs, you don't have to worry about having sufficient reserves and so on and so forth. When you go into a combat environment, the straight line, sort of projection that people do from land-based air just doesn't work. I mean, if you are going to a target, you don't fly from point A to point B in a straight line. You have to think of the forces that are interpositioned, you have to think of the threats, so you've got dog legs. So your ranges immediately begin to constrict, right? So land-based aviation really becomes, the challenges are actually far more. Not to mention things like, the amount of time you spend essentially uselessly getting to targets and so on and so forth. Now the nuclear submarine question, because everyone answers this. In an ideal world, it would be wonderful if the United States could help India build nuclear submarines. But it is never going to happen in my lifetime. And I'll tell you why. And even I will not advocate it for a very simple reason. Underseas warfare is the one area where the United States has unparalleled primacy in the international system. There is no other country in the world that comes close to what the United States Navy does in the business of underseas warfare. There is no way that the US will give anyone those capabilities. I mean, we are extremely careful about providing those capabilities to our closest allies. And so it won't happen. And, I think if one were to sort of balance carrier cooperation versus cooperation developing SSNs, I think for all the difficulties, carrier cooperation is far more in the realm of feasibility than any cooperation with SSNs. It's just a reality of the environment in which, we are. And so I cannot in good conscience advocate that the US go out and help India with respect to SSNs. It won't happen. I mean, even if someone were to bribe me sufficiently to say it, and I'm willing to accept money to do some things, it would carry absolutely no weight with anyone because it would be laughed out of court.
Okay, Vishal, like I said, we've operated light, small carriers for 40, 50 years. They've been good for training, for building up expertise, etc. Now we've reached a stage where we can build a big carrier, and economics, operational requirements, etc., tell us that we should have a medium-sized carrier, 40, 50, 60,000 tons. And fortunately, there is, at this moment, there is no debate on the carrier. The government has approved of it. The Air Force is quiet, etc. So I think the carrier debate is behind us. So we need not waste time on that. Ashley, thank you for your noble efforts. I'm sure half the people will have their fingers crossed that it works out and the other half will say it doesn't. But nations will do whatever suits their interest, national interest best. So let's wait and see what happens, inshallah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, Ashley. Great. Good company. Oh, thanks. I am, but I'm leaving tomorrow. All well.